Well, what you're about to see is how to change the Arrma Nero pinion gear step by step. I recorded this because it's not the easiest of jobs. Once it's done, it's a set it and forget it job. It isn't something that you're going to do in 5 minutes. Allow yourself 45 minutes to an hour for doing this. Make sure you've got all your good tools on hand. Good set of hexagonal sockets like these ones from Dynamite will greatly help. You will however need the Allen key in places due to the amount of leverage you're going to need to put on some of the ones that have got thread lock on there, and you're also going to need thread lock for putting the thing back together. I've documented everything step by step in the forthcoming video, so if you want to learn to know how to change your Arrma pinion gear, keep watching, and by all means subscribe. The first thing they say to do is to remove the top here, so I'm just going to pull these two clips out which are particularly stubborn to remove, and that should then allow this to come off in its entirety. Next step is to remove this cover. There are 4 screws, one on each corner of the box. So just going to use my hex wrench, get those undone. Okay, remove this cover, keep all 4 screws safely with it, obviously. Put that out of the way for the minute. Would say a set of good hex wrenches is going to make your life a lot easier when doing this job. The next step is to remove the number 1 lead out of the receiver here. Once you've disconnected channel 1 from the receiver, your next job is going to be to unplug all 3 of the power leads here. All the power leads disconnected now. Channel 1 disconnected. Now going to turn the car over and remove the base plate. The base plate is removed using these 2 hex screws, one here and one here. So just going to do that. Well, with this rear cover removed, we've now got access to everything we need inside. When I fit it back on, I'm actually going to fit on the extra vented one that's supplied with the car rather than the older one. Next of all, you're going to need to remove this screw holding the connecting rod to this servo in place. Okay, next up you're going to need to remove each of the drive shafts. You're going to need to use your hex wrench to undo this little collar here and another collar the other side. Fairly self-apparent, struggling to get it in the light here, but with just one either side, 1 screw in each, and just pull them back. Well, when removing the 2 screws, one from each side, from each drive shaft rather, they're quite hard to remove. The first one I use the hex driver to push through from underneath and then struggle to find the damn thing. I would recommend using some needle nose pliers and just gently pulling the thing out when you've loosened it. As I say, they are reluctant to come out. Now, if I've done everything right, both drive shafts should now be able to pull back. Yeah, there we go. And this one's going to be tricky this side, harder to get the fingers in, so I'm going to do that off camera. The same thing, we're just going to pull that back away. Well, the next step is to be able to remove the whole motor and gearbox assembly, the diff assembly there in the center. There are 4 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4 on each side, left and right here, that we're going to need to remove, 8 in total. So I'm going to do that, and then this should enable this to just be able to lift out if everything goes well. Correction, I would say to do that you're going to need to open the battery tray each side, and then you go through this hole, and you're then going to be able to get access to the bolt that you need to undo, which is done fairly tightly, feeling that. All 4 screws out on this side, so just going to spin it round and do exactly the same on this side. Well, I've removed all 4 screws each side, as I say 8 in total. Now pushing the battery doors down so they're not flopping around while I'm removing the motor. One last thing to do before I finally remove the motor, just going to remove the servo wire completely from here, and I'm going to have to tie that back with something when I put it back together. Now I've done all the screws, just going to turn the steering so steering is clear out the way here, and with any luck, he says, with a bit of a wiggle and a jiggle, this is not the easiest thing to remove. They make it look like this thing just falls out in your hands. There's a lot of wiggling and jiggling around. Seem to be catching on something fairly minor that was preventing it from coming up. However, the whole unit will, he says, now come out. We've got a lead in here, which it looks like we're just going to have to remove that from there very gently. Indeed. Well, you'll probably be glad I'm filming this. There is another lead here for the diff brain, which I'm going to unplug. The instructions, it looks as though, don't show the actual diff brain model, which this one is with the little additional servo on here to remove. So you've got this extra lead, doesn't show that in the instructions. Well, taking our assembly here, and now going to need to remove this screw. This is a clamp type design, and then this whole servo assembly will come off away from this end. Given the tightness of this screw, I would recommend using an Allen key on here. So nail loosen. It does come loose fairly easy, but you're going to need one for tightening that back up for sure. Very hard to release this. The next and one of the nearly final steps in disassembling this is to undo these three hex bolts here, so as we can completely remove this assembly and get to the pinion gear finally. Well, after removing those three screws, which were very, very tight, you're going to need to make sure you've got exactly the right size hex driver to release those. I don't know if they had thread lock on or not, I'm not quite sure, but they were very, very tight indeed. Great deal of care needed not to strip the head on them. So just going to change the pinion gear, 15 tooth one here, for the 17 tooth one. Something to note, on this pinion gear it has two screws, one either side, so don't be trying to prise the thing off without having undone the other one. Well, there we are, finally got the old spur gear off. Even that kind of wanted to have a bit of a fight right the way through to the end there. I am going to put thread lock on both of the studs, fixing it back in, and leave that to set overnight to make sure it's nice and tight. Well, here's where life gets interesting. In the instructions, it's very ambiguous. It shows the gears here being, there's like 4 different diagrams showing it in each of the opposing 4 holes on here, and no wording at all as to which ones you need to use for the 17 tooth pinion. The 15 tooth, the screws are at the bottom one on this side, the top one on this side. So I've moved them one round, put thread lock back on them, as they both had thread lock on them originally, and it shows to put that in the diagram, and I'm now going to try and marry that back up with the rest of the gearbox. Well, just loosely holding the thing together, all these 3 holes now appear to be perfectly lining up, so I'm assuming this is now my perfect gear mesh in the middle there. There is no flexibility here like you can sometimes have the slots to move them around. These are 4 individual holes drilled on either side, so limited in choice of position, but I guess that is for the holding strength there, so there's no torque twist moves it. So I'm going to put those 3 screws in and get the gearbox back together. Well, my screws and 3 screws are back in nice and securely here. Whole thing very, very solidly assembled here. This should not be moving around in a hurry if I've done everything correctly. I would recommend taking the time to put the thread lock on there, making sure everything is nice and tight before putting it all back together. So going to put the servo element back on now. Well, the next thing to do is to put the servo assembly back onto this housing here. Now, I recommend doing this on a flat surface because you need to make sure both of these parts are nice and level together for when you put it back into the chassis. Well, ignore what I've just said. It's got this shaped design on here, so it can only fit on the one way, so you don't have to worry about leveling it up or anything. So I've just popped that back on there now, push it down nice and firmly, and then I'm just going to tighten this screw to tighten this clamp to make sure this doesn't move anywhere. Everything nice and tightly together again now. Just going to put the whole assembly back in the chassis. Well, just some general housekeeping here. First of all, the little extra servo wire for the diff brain that I mentioned that isn't shown in the instructions is going to need plugging back in to this little lead here, and that then pushes into this little cable clamp on the side there. Your main steering servo lead here is just going to thread down through the hole in here, ready to plug back into the receiver there. Once this lead's plugged back in, I'm just going to snap it back home into here. Well, this actually plugs in very, very easily, so there's no need to force this connector in. I thought initially I was going to have a really hard push, just pops in. So now I'm going to rotate the gearbox back over the other way, so you want the servo facing towards you, and just push the power leads gently through to underneath. I'm not going to worry too much about those, as I should, he says, be able to reach those from the other side, taking great care to ensure the receiver lead pops down correctly underneath, so I can get to that as well. What I found is, you need a little bit of wiggling and jiggling on there, but you need to be careful of the wiring here down in the middle, that you're not affecting that, and so on and so on. It seems to move down relatively easily, but then catch on something that is obscured halfway. So I'm just going a bit more wiggling and jiggling off camera, get that down in place. Well, it seemed to be catching on nothing other than itself. When I've pulled the chassis apart slightly, then the whole thing's just instantly dropped down, so I just need to wiggle this back into place so these 4 screws from either side can get back in there. Nice and level, ready to get the 4 screws back in. Well, I've now raised the battery tray covers up in the air again, and I'm fitting the 4 screws through on this side and the 4 screws on that side. Just going to put each 4 in on each side loosely to start with, so everything's in and I've got all 8 in total, then tighten them all up. Well, I've now got all 4 screws on in each side, so I'm just going through, tightening them up, making sure everything is nice and firmly back together again. Next up is to take the servo horn here, the servo arm, and put it back on the servo horn. You need to take a great deal of care that this does not get caught in this little hole in the side of the chassis when you're reassembling it. Well, one of the final tasks now is to reconnect the drive shafts. Now they have this little collar on the end of them that you need to, it's got the hole through, you need to line up with the hole on the inside. Now the slightly tricky bit is, as you try and put them on the shaft there, this hole is maybe going to move around from there, so I think this may be a bit of a pig of a job, which is going to take me a little time to do. The one on this side looks to be extremely difficult to do because this shaft is much shorter. You haven't got anywhere near the flexibility and the movement of the long one on this side, so I'm going to do this one first, see how I get on, and then on to the other one. So all you've got to do, put the screw back through, a little bit of thread lock on there. Obviously I should say the shaft here is spring loaded on this bit. You've got a little bit of flex in there, so you're just going to push that back to get it onto the to get this end back onto the shaft there. Well, that's this one in nice and secure, so this drive shaft shouldn't be going anywhere. Again, I'm going to leave the thread lock drying overnight, not on any big rush there. On this side, got the problem, this is a much shorter movement to get on there, so I'm going to turn the camera off on that one, as that's not going to be easy. Well, I've managed to get the short shaft on. It is much harder, and I would recommend using a pair of pliers to help you leave the shaft on. And what I did was I put the my hex driver through the 2 holes until I could align everything up together. Made life much easier, and now I should just be able to tighten this up to finish. Well, the last thing to do on this side is to fit the new vented cover on, just with the 2 screws on there. So I'm going to do that, then flip the car over. Well, moving back round to the top here, the last little bit that we have to do here is just plug the receiver, the wire back into socket number 1. Okay, we're good to go on there. Next, we need to reconnect our motor wires here. So now, car's pretty much ready to go. We just need to get our waterproofing box back on over the receiver with our 4 screws on here. So I'm just going to tidy this wiring up slightly and put the lid back on. Once you plug the wire back in, there is a little bit of care needed. The wires need to come out of this end of the receiver box, so you need to kind of scrunch everything down here, push this little card down to the side, very carefully ensuring there's nothing around the watertight seal. Then, all being well, we're going to put our waterproof box back on there. Now I've got my hex wrench to hand, which I'm then going to use to tighten the 4 screws back up. Quick check, see if everything's running. Well, everything is back together now. Nothing more to screw or wire back together. Now just going to figure out where that goes in. This pushes back in. There's 3 slots under here. Okay, those 3 slots okay under there. These push down over the front 2, and then you're just going to use these 2 little clips again to push through and lock in place from either side. Well, I hope you found that video useful. It does show there's quite a bit of effort involved in changing the pinion gear on the Arrma Nero, but once it's set well and good, and you shouldn't need to do anything with it again. Given the length of time, and hopefully I've made it look reasonably easy in this video, the reality of it is, without me showing you step by step, it will take you a hell of a lot longer. The instructions slightly lacking in places because there's not so many written words on there, etc. Would recommend a good set of hex drivers when you start out. You will need the Allen key in places just due to the Loctite, etc. Being on the screws. So looking forward to giving this a good test. If you found this video useful, please do subscribe and give us a thumbs up, and by all means share with friends and other Arrma groups. Well, thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then please do like, and by all means subscribe.